much room to put my notes.
Right, thanks everyone for attending. Thanks for coming on today. Obviously, a big day for football. In attendance, we have Andrew Pragnell down the far right, of my right, Muir, our reviewer, also our president, Deryck. The format for today is Pip's going to take us through the report, and then there'll be comments from Deryck and also Andrew, and then we'll open up for questions on the back of it. So I'll just ask you to start off with assessing your report.
Thanks, Peter. Deryck, were you going to say some opening words?
I thought I would. Kia ora tātou katoa. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending this conference this afternoon. And I would like to formally introduce our independent reviewer, Ms. Pip Muir, who's a partner with Simpson Grierson, and our interim chief executive, Andrew Pragnell, who's here with us today as well. I'd also like to acknowledge Harry Nata, who's here from the Professional Footballers Association. So Harry, it's nice to have you here with us. So I'm going to invite Ms. Muir now to present her report, and then both Andrew and I will respond with some brief comments around the report, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So thank you for being here. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Pip Muir, and I was tasked by New Zealand Football to undertake this review. It arose initially from the complaints of 12 Football Fern players, and that was on the 8th of June 2018. The players are all employees of New Zealand Football and are represented by the New Zealand Professional Footballers Association, generally known by, I think, all of you as the PFA. The complaints related to 2 recent tours of the Football Ferns in Spain in March 2018 and in Wellington in June 2018. The players alleged breaches of New Zealand Football's Code of Conduct, harassment policy, and WorkSafe New Zealand's bullying guidelines. On the 20th of June, 2 days after receiving those complaints, New Zealand Football appointed me to undertake the review and announced the same day that Mr. Haraf, the head coach of the Football Ferns, and New Zealand Football's technical director would be going on special leave until the completion of my review. The terms of reference were set by New Zealand Football in consultation with the PFA, the Players Association, and were very specific and have necessarily dictated the way I have interviewed and answered the questions in that review in my report. I had to review the complaints, these were the terms of reference, and assess whether there'd been any breaches, inappropriate conduct, and whether New Zealand Football knew of the allegations and whether they responded adequately. And I was tasked with preparing public outcomes and recommendations and a confidential report, which I've given this morning, verbal report to the board. On the 29th of June, New Zealand Football announced that its CEO, Mr. Andy Martin, was retiring at the end of the month. And then Mr. Haraf's resignation was announced with immediate effect on 1 August 2018 while my review was underway. The terms of the departures of both Mr. Martin and Mr. Haraf were confidential, and this has limited what I can and have reported in this review about them. Although in relation to Mr. Haraf, the review was underway and it was made plain that my findings would be coming out in any event. If I turn to the review process, New Zealand Football gave me full access to all information I needed. I spoke to employees, I reviewed policies, I viewed employment agreements, exit arrangements, and the like. I set up an independent email address so that people could confidentially come to me and speak to me about any matter because of the wide-ranging nature of the terms of reference. I interviewed everyone outside of New Zealand Football, mainly at Simpson Grierson's offices, and have conducted over 80 interviews. This is people coming to me. All 12, and those interviews included all 12 players who made the complaints from the Football Ferns, They, of course, are professional footballers based around the world, so theirs were via teleconference, Skype, WhatsApp, and so forth. I interviewed the then Football Ferns coach, Mr. Haraf, New Zealand Football's former chief executive, Mr. Martin, current and former New Zealand Football staff, PFA representatives, including the General Counsel, Mr. Scott Howman, who made his own written complaint, and I have addressed that in the body of my report. Former All Whites and former Football Fern players, representatives from the federations, the Football Foundation, Wellington Phoenix, football clubs, volunteers, football coaches, referees. I spoke to Sarai Beerman, the Chief Women's Football Officer for FIFA globally, and I spoke to Peter Miskimen, the Chief Executive of Sport New Zealand, and also other football stakeholders, administrators, and sports organisation representatives. Before I turn to my findings and recommendations, I just want to make a couple of opening comments. The context of this review is relevant. As you will all be aware in this room, New Zealand Football is not the only national sports organisation facing a review at present. We also have underway Hockey New Zealand, Rowing New Zealand, Cycling New Zealand, in conjunction with High Performance Sport, Triathlon New Zealand, Netball Phase 1's completed, and we've recently had New Zealand Rugby Union's Respect and Responsibility report. It is clear that all of those organisations are having to grapple with what success looks like for their organisation in 2018 and beyond. Winning, of course, is important, but so is the well-being of players and athletes. Football, as we know, is a truly global sport with authentic worldwide reach. And we have over 150,000 players in New Zealand who are registered and 10 international teams through New Zealand Football. And I want to say at the outset that the New Zealand Football staff have worked hard over recent years to develop the game of football and to introduce significant initiatives for the betterment of the sport. Having undertaken all of those reviews and considered the terms of reference, there are a number of key themes and findings that I have identified throughout this review. My first theme I can describe as player welfare. I find that the Football Ferns complaints were genuine and justified, and that the welfare of those players on the Spain and Wellington tours was not sufficiently a focus of New Zealand football. The players were brave in coming forward, in making their complaints. They effectively put their careers at risk. They said that they would not stay a football fern and continue to play for their country if the coach remained in place. And that is not something, from having interviewed those players, I can tell you, they did lightly. These matters were serious for them. Mr. Haraf, the coach of the Ferns at the relevant times, came to New Zealand from Austria in 2017 to take up the role of technical director. He'd previously coached men's age group national football teams in Austria, not women's teams. At the end of 2017, New Zealand Football appointed Mr. Haraf head coach of the Ferns, in addition to his full-time technical director role, contrary to a FIFA guideline which recommends the technical director is not also a national coach of a sporting organisation. And this was done without any recruitment process or selection panel. Mr. Haraf was then in charge of the Ferns on the tours in Spain and Wellington. I find that Mr. Haraf breached New Zealand Football's Code of Conduct, harassment policy and WorkSafe New Zealand's bullying guidelines. I want to make the point that the harassment was not sexual in any form, and it wasn't assault, but it was raised voices, it was yelling, it was intimidation, it was repeated. He offended, humiliated some of those players and some of the staff, and this has had an impact on all of the 12 players who complained and on a number of staff. Some New Zealand football managers were told of player and staff concerns after the Spain tour, but no action was taken. I want to make the point that New Zealand football shares responsibility for what occurred. Mr. Haraf was not sufficiently inducted into his role as head coach. Bear in mind, he came to New Zealand as the technical director, for which he was well qualified. There was no mentoring about coaching a New Zealand women's team or about Kiwi performance culture and punching above your weight. To the contrary, Mr. Haraf's direct style was supported by the management of New Zealand football to bring about change. The second theme is about New Zealand football structure and processes. I find that, if I can call the board EXCO, because that's what they're commonly known as, EXCO has been too hands-off in its governance in relation to high performance and human resource matters in recent years. I also find that cost constraints in what is a difficult financial environment for sports organisations when you are driven and constrained by funding and grants. These constraints have driven certain behaviours in New Zealand football. For example, not making certain staff appointments to save costs, where board meetings are held and the like. A third part of the New Zealand football structure that is an important part of my theme is human resources. The organisation has not had a dedicated human resources role and is suffering from not having that or having sufficient capability in relation to policies, training, staff wellbeing and the like. And finally, under that structure and processes theme, recruitment process is a key one. The recent processes for many appointments, both in the coaching side and in staff, have not always been robust or transparent. The third theme is around culture and diversity in New Zealand football. There has been high turnover recently. It's reduced in the past year, but there have been numerous exit agreements and many staff working long hours to cover when there are vacancies. Excuse me. Diversity and inclusion is lacking in the workplace. There are no women in senior management in New Zealand football, and only 21% of the entire staff is female. There is a perception, and I do not say this is the case throughout New Zealand football, but there is a perception, both internally and externally by some, that New Zealand football is a boys' club. There needs to be better pathways for female coaches in New Zealand football as well. A fourth theme is around stakeholder relationships. New Zealand football's relationship with key stakeholders, particularly the PFA and the federations, is not great. It has been strained. Rebuilding has been occurring, and this is particularly the case since Mr. Pragnell has come in as Interim Chief Executive, and there are good steps being taken. But an awful lot of feedback was about the strain on stakeholder relationships and the lack of engagement. So I'll now turn to my recommendations. There are 22 recommendations in my report. I won't go through them all in detail, but you should have all been provided with a copy of that. But they fall into 5 categories. First of all, in relation to the football ferns. Secondly, player welfare. Thirdly, again, similar to the themes, New Zealand football structure and processes. Fourthly, culture and diversity in New Zealand football. And finally, stakeholders. So if I look first of all at the football ferns, my key recommendations here, and indeed the first one, is that New Zealand football, I recommend New Zealand football takes responsibility for what happened and proactively works to address this. New Zealand football should acknowledge that the complaints have been upheld by me and apologise to the players. The players should be listened to as part of this process, and New Zealand football should provide support and counselling for those players where or if it is needed. Secondly, the second area of recommendations is in relation to player welfare. There needs to be greater player welfare focus in the high performance area. I don't think, from having interviewed a wide range of sports organisations and leaders of sports organisations, not just in football, I do not think that this is a matter just for football. It seems to me the focus on high performance sport and the well-being and welfare of athletes and players is a key topic at the moment. I'm aware that EXCO has recently set up a welfare committee, but that's embryonic, but it is a step in the right direction. The Professional Footballers Association, the Players' Union, needs to be consulted about these initiatives. They have not been on so many of these matters, and they have a collective agreement. They are employees of New Zealand Football, these players, and they have a collective agreement with New Zealand Football which provides them with express contractual rights for their union to be consulted on matters like the head coach and contribution to EXCO meetings and the like. That has not been happening. And there needs therefore to be greater respect and adherence to that collective agreement. Some players saw the pay equity deal earlier this year, which was great progress, may I say. But some players sadly saw that as a media moment that was then ignored when the first tour came along after that and they sought to have equity in relation to travel to the game. Similarly, consultation over head coach roles has not been happening. Now, the interim CEO has been making good progress in terms of rebuilding this relationship, but further engagement is required. And in my view, this will take genuine effort on both sides. This is not a one-way street. There needs to be a culture rebuild for the football ferns as a priority. This is something that New Zealand Football needs to initiate, but has to be done with the PFA and the players. The FIFA Women's World Cup is next year. Urgent team building of players and coaching staff is required to enable them to move forward, as I'm sure they want to, which is positively and in a unified way. EXCO need to receive tour reports after tours. This has not been happening. Player and staff welfare is at stake on these tours, and that is a health and safety matter that resides with the board and senior management. Importantly, and concerningly, there are currently no player complaints processes for the elite teams. Where do you go when you've got a serious concern about another player, about a referee, about your coach? This needs to be developed as a priority with the PFA and the players, so that hopefully we can avoid situations like this in the future by dealing with them quickly and safely. I note that all of the recent head coaches of New Zealand's elite women's teams have been men, and I go back to the theme that pathways for female football coaches to progress in New Zealand are not well defined and need review. Third area of recommendations is in relation to New Zealand Football's structure and processes. Two aspects of that, the staffing side and the board side. Looking first at the board, EXCO needs to make conscious decisions on the findings and recommendations in this review. There have been previous reviews which I have seen, and I've interviewed people who have written those reviews, particularly in relation to the All Whites in 2014, which were actioned to an extent by EXCO, but never then shared with players or with the PFA or wider stakeholders. And so there was a perception that nothing happened, which is not in fact the case. It's merely a fact that there wasn't the communication around it. The board, I recommend, needs to show and demonstrate strong and inclusive leadership with its next CEO. And there is a need for greater reporting from management to the board. For example, tour reports, human resource matters, player welfare, high performance issues. Excuse me. EXCO needs to review its current delegations policy in relation to key appointments, recruitments, settlement agreements for departing staff and the like. The board also needs to review its current standing committees. That's a recommendation to look at and including looking at the operation and effectiveness of a separate New Zealand Football Committee, which is a FIFA requirement in terms of an ethics committee. But where does that sit in terms of player complaints and the standing committees that the board should have, in my recommendation? And 2 committees I recommend they consider as part of the structure of the board and ensure they have balance on those committees is the High Performance Committee. There is no High Performance Committee. And potentially with people with football experience on that committee, such as past players, coaches and the like. And I also recommend consideration be given to a remuneration and wellbeing subcommittee of the board to look at diversity and inclusion, remuneration, HR issues and welfare, both for staff and players. The other part of the structure and policies of New Zealand football that I have recommendations for is in relation to management and staff. New Zealand football's leadership needs to be aligned to its culture. Staff need to be empowered to develop a culture that's respectful, inclusive, and has a common vision. And I recommend a separate HR function, even just on a contracted basis for a period, should be set up to review policies, monitor employee matters, and place greater focus on staff wellbeing. I appreciate resources are scarce, so consideration could perhaps be given to shared services models with human resources matters for the federations, Football New Zealand, Sport New Zealand. That's just something to consider. Recruitment processes within New Zealand football definitely need reviewing, and transparent and robust processes need to be put in place. For example, the Football Ferns coach appointment, which Mr. Pragnell can probably tell you more about in a minute, needs to have a selection panel this time, and a recruitment process, and PFA consultation. Plus, my recommendation is that the coach should have proven experience of working at a national level with women's football. The 4th area of recommendations is in relation to New Zealand football's culture and diversity. I recommend there is a rebuild of the culture to ensure there's trust and engagement with staff and players. The staff surveys, inductions, exit processes and the like should be reviewed as part of that. New Zealand football needs to walk the talk in relation to that collective agreement with the players, and it needs to improve its gender diversity and develop a diversity and inclusion policy. And I recommend a diversity dashboard for the board so that they can monitor how this is progressing. They need to lead from the top in terms of their values and move away from that current perception of a boys' club and tolerance of inappropriate banter in pockets of the workplace. I want to make it clear I'm not saying that is throughout the workplace, and I have met excellent people throughout New Zealand football. But I would recommend unconscious bias training be undertaken as a good first step. And my final recommendation is in relation to the relationships with key stakeholders in the football community. Positive steps have been started by New Zealand football with the summit that was held in September. But New Zealand football and EXCO need to proactively engage with key stakeholders in the football community to strengthen relationships which are strained in places, particularly in relation to the Professional Footballers Association, the federations and the Wellington Phoenix. I want to make a couple of concluding remarks before I hand over to Andrew Pragnell. First, my findings and recommendations should not be seen as a criticism of the performance of the staff of New Zealand football. They are by and large dedicated, hard-working and committed employees, doing their best to ensure that more New Zealanders can play and love football, and so that New Zealand's elite teams are best placed to win at global pinnacle events. And I wish to finish by acknowledging and thanking all of the 80 or so people who came forward to share their stories and to be interviewed. In particular, the 12 Football Ferns players who were brave enough to make the complaints that led to this review. I'm hopeful that this will lead to positive change for player welfare and in the culture and workplace of Football New Zealand. Thank you. Andrew. Deryck.
On behalf of New Zealand Football, I'd like to extend our thanks to Ms Muir for a very, very comprehensive review and accompanying report. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the 80 individuals and organisations that contributed to the review and its findings, in particular the players who were very brave to come forward and keep coming forward when we failed them by not listening. On behalf of New Zealand Football, our Executive Committee and management, I apologise to our Football Fern players for the conduct of their coach and for the failings in our organisation. We are deeply sorry that these events took place and the distress caused. On behalf of the board, I've written to each of the players concerned, and we have undertaken to meet with them personally as soon as possible to discuss the report. We have plans underway to meet them face-to-face with members of our Executive Committee and Management in mid-November when they are together, and that's the earliest opportunity we've got to meet them face-to-face. This morning our Executive Committee met with Ms Muir to receive and discuss the report and its findings with her. The board has resolved to receive the report and adopt all of its findings and recommendations in full and implement them as soon as practicable. The board also resolved to engage with the football community on next steps and with management to set up a review group. ExCo accepts full responsibility for the findings of the review and will be reflecting on its performance and seeking confirmation of its mandate with football members as soon as practicable. It is clear that we have work to do to improve our relationships with players and staff with a focus on player welfare, and we have a big job to do to rebuild the trust and engagement amongst our players, our staff and our key football partners. As Ms Muir has said, there needs to be a greater focus on diversity and inclusion going forward, both with players and staff. At the heart of this are our people, our players, our staff and our partners. Hei tangata, hei tangata, hei tangata. We need to invest in building greater capability and better processes and human resources, and we'll be working with management to make this a priority. I'd like now to hand over to our Interim Chief Executive, Andrew Pragnell, to talk to some of the operational elements of the report's recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Deryck. Kia ora and good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, having been the Interim Chief Executive for the past few months, I just want to acknowledge the football community first and foremost, and a lot of our critical key stakeholders like the PFA for their support and in terms of working with us to support the whole organisation. I'd secondly like to thank Pip Muir for her report and the recommendations. I think they give the really clear direction for the work program for us to make change and for the good of the organisation to come. I think it represents a real opportunity for football to make positive change. I'd also like to acknowledge the players and the staff who have spoken out. I want to thank them for doing that, and I want to extend my apology to them on behalf of management for the failings of the organisation to respond adequately to them at the time. I've just come from a briefing with all staff on the findings of the report and the recommendations. Like me, they're taking some time to digest those findings and those recommendations. Obviously my door and phone will be open to them over the coming few days and weeks to work with them and ensure we provide the best possible response and take on board their feedback. Management's committed to supporting the Executive Committee and actioning the review's recommendations. And we see this as an opportunity to make meaningful change in the organisation as it matures and to ensure that situations like this don't ever happen again. The reviews highlighted a number of policy and process changes that need to take place. These will require a whole of organisation approach and a team approach across the staff. We're underway now with the recruitment for a new head coach for the Football Ferns. I can confirm that this is a rigorous process, contestable, and will involve a number of independent panel members, including representation from the PFA, former Football Ferns players, and former Football Ferns coaching staff. I'm confident we'll appoint a high quality head coach in the coming few weeks. Finally, I want to really acknowledge the hard work of the New Zealand football staff, all of our federations, and in particular all of the volunteers across the New Zealand football community who've continued to help the game grow during what has been a challenging time for the national body. Everyone I've met and had the privilege to work with and be introduced to across football has their heart absolutely committed in the right place and are doing their best to grow the game and are hugely passionate about the game. So I'm looking forward to putting these changes in place, so ensuring we're a better employer and also making the organisation and sport even stronger. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. So before we start the Q&A, there's a couple of things I need to point out. Obviously, it's been a legal situation, so there are privacy concerns and constraints for what we can actually deal with here. So in terms of incidents involved, there's only so much detail we can go into. In terms of the contributions, the contributors came forward on the basis of confidentiality, and that's going to be obviously upheld today. So as such, we won't be discussing individual incidents that happened within the review or its findings. We're talking in general themes. So that's just the premise to start the Q&A, but welcome questions from the floor.
First of all, I mean, the findings about Andreas Rath and his behaviour during his time as Football Ferns coach, how would you describe it, having interviewed everyone during his time as head coach of Football Ferns?
They were serious, partly because they were repeated, and the impact they had on the players and also on some of the staff. This wasn't just in relation to the players. There was at least one staff member who left over it. I wouldn't have made the findings if I didn't think they meet the threshold.
And his recruitment process has also been brought up as a grey area. How would you describe that recruitment process?
The recruitment of Mr. Haraf as technical director was robust and transparent, and he was selected as the best candidate, and that decision should be respected. And then we had the departure of the previous Football Ferns coach, and so it was decided that Mr. Haraf would go as interim coach for the tour to Thailand last year. And at the end of that, which was a very successful tour for the Ferns, and they won the second game 5-0. And three of the players, together with a couple of the management, were very supportive of Mr. Haraf staying on. But then that should have been matter that went back to New Zealand football and went through a recruitment process. It was only the voices of three players, and in any event, there was then no advertisement, no recruitment. Mr. Haraf was appointed. It was raised at a board meeting on the 19th of December, but effectively for noting, and he was appointed the next day.
So who was approving these? Is this the board, administration?
Management.
So in your point of view, should he have been appointed as Football Ferns coach?
He was, so we have to live with that, but there was no process, and that's not appropriate. And he was also the technical director, and there's a FIFA guideline that does not recommend that. He already had a full-time job. He took this on, and in some ways, this was again cost constraints driven because it saved a full salary here. And management decided he was well suited for the role. Now, I've pointed out in my findings that he'd never coached a national women's team before, and he was trying to bring about some changes to develop a winning way, which needed care.
In your opinion, did management have too much power?
I couldn't comment on that. What I can say is, as I found here, there should have been greater oversight by the board.
Deryck, it's, the findings about Andreas Rath are damning, but also the findings of the are also equally damning. How much responsibility do you take in this?
The board accepts full responsibility for the findings and has adopted those. I think one of the things in relation to senior appointments within the organisation, for example, the new Ferns appointment will require the agreement of the board. So all senior leadership positions, all sort of national coaches, will require sign-off from the board. That hasn't happened historically.
What do you make of the two hands-off finding in here?
Certainly in relation to the issues around player welfare and complaints processes, certainly support that. I think it's, if you look at the wider range of activity of the board, it's pretty hands-on in lots of other areas, for example, around tours and how they're constructed. There's a whole risk management program that goes around that. That has a sign-off requirement around the finance committee, but that circle was never completed relative to tour reports coming back to the board. So I think there's some real learnings for this. That's why we've adopted all the recommendations in the report and accept those.
Pip, you spoke about Andy and Andreas as part of this. How would you characterise your interviews and just talking with them?
Very professional. I can tell you Mr. Haraf was very distressed by the fact that so much of this is played out in the media, and he's been here in New Zealand on his own. I've made findings in relation to them, but I want to balance that by saying this has been very difficult for him too.
Would you say that you got what you wanted out of it, or would you have...
They were very cooperative.
Did you speak to Andreas after or before he resigned?
After.
And when did you speak to Andy?
After. They had both departed Football New Zealand when I interviewed them. Sorry.
How do you define harassment and differentiate that from sort of passionate coaching that we're so used to seeing in football?
Well, that's right. I mean, and in the body of my findings, I do make that distinction and say that I appreciate a lot of people say, well, that's just robust coaching. I think is one of the phrases I used. And we all accept there needs to be robust coaching. We all want New Zealand to win at big events, don't get me wrong. But there is a body of law around where it is offensive, where it's humiliating, where you feel intimidated, where people yell, and how that behaviour is received that crosses the line. And on a number of occasions, this was not robust coaching. It absolutely crossed the line. And also in relation to staff, where there was yelling acknowledged on both sides.
And you point out it as a gender thing as well. There's different sort of coaching approaches, coaching females as opposed to males.
Yes. Again, that's probably something that's not for me to take any further than that, but I have spoken to people like Sarai Beerman and who are technical experts at FIFA in Zurich, made the point to me that while coaching men and women generally is the same, there are different physiological and physical demands that need to be taken into account. And indeed, there's a lot developing about how you explain differently to men and women's teams often, the rationale, a lot more of the why often for women's teams.
I guess just on that, either Deryck or Andrew, how are you going to get more women into senior roles within the organisation or the coaching as well?
I'm happy to answer that. Yeah, look, so I think first of all, the report speaks for itself in terms of the gender imbalance in the organisation. So that's something that in terms of first and foremost getting a diversity and inclusion policy that the organisation respects and refers to. In terms of making change, that some of that's a longer term exercise. There's a number of programs underway to get more female coaches into the pathway. We've got some great coaches coming through, obviously like Gemma Lewis and otherwise. So making sure they're supported and that the support structures are in place and we give them professional development opportunities.
Deryck, you said that you failed the girls by not listening. Why, I suppose on reflection, why did you guys not listen sooner?
I think we didn't have the processes to allow those things to come forward in terms of complaints processes, player welfare. I think often sports organisations are quite focused on winning. Certainly the New Zealand public expect every time we turn up on the pitch. So I think there were deficiencies certainly in the complaints processes. I think in reporting through tour reports into board environments. So I think those things, as Ms Muir has said, could have been identified earlier and we could have taken action earlier.
How are you going to get the confidence back from these girls and I suppose the public as well?
I think that is really a matter of actually demonstrating the actions that we need to do. We've certainly, as I said, I've written, or the board's written to all the affected players today, apologising. That letter's gone. I'm certainly available, and any board member and management are available to meet with them. I think there's developmental work, cultural work that we've got to do as an organisation around that space. My sense on these things is you really have to demonstrate things by actions. Words are easy. We need to be doing things, and people need to be saying things. And I don't expect that process to be easy. I think it's there's issues of trust and confidence, but I can assure you that there's the full support of the board in working through these matters and the full commitment around it.
Did Andy Martin and Andreas get a payout? And if they did, how can they get a payout when the findings of this are so damning?
Those are matters that there are privacy constraints around and we can't comment on them.
Deryck, Pip surmised that the environment within New Zealand football akin to a boys' club. What was your reaction when you heard that particular comment?
I think really the facts speak in the report around the need for greater balance around culture and diversity within the organisation, and that's something that I've certainly reflected on, the board's reflected on, and it's really what we need to be doing, understanding that that's the perception that's there now, and what we need to do to sort of move forward around greater gender balance, more diversity in our workplace. And I think the workplace in New Zealand football actually should be reflective of the game relative to people who participate in it, and it's not reflective of the game right now. So it's something that's really critical for us, and we need to own that and accept it, and then move forward around the appropriate steps we need to take.
Deryck, regardless of the if there was a process in place to handle complaints, you had a complaint and you failed to act on it. So,
Which
after the Scotland tour,
the complaint went through management.
so you're saying that there was a lack.
It wasn't escalated into the board environment, so the board didn't have visibility on that.
What does that mean? What does that say?
So it tells me the process was deficient.
But there are certain examples in here where the board have failed to act on complaints, whether it be from players or coaches who have missed out, etc. Board showed negligence in any way?
I don't think that's a question for me to answer. The board's going to have to look at that, certainly not in my remit or terms of reference. I've set out the findings and the recommendations.
What about you, Deryck? Can you answer that question?
I think that we've been deficient in our processes and haven't had visibility that we needed to around particular parts of the game, around player welfare, around high performance.
So as the leader as the chair, do you feel like you need to stand down?
I'm committed to the findings from the review and implementing those. I think that's the critical aspect. I think the membership of the organisation will reflect on the report, and the board is looking at that. It's reflecting on the findings, and we're all taking ownership around those and what it means to move forward around football.
What do you say? So what do you say to the football community then?
What I say to the football community is that we've received the report. We have unanimously adopted all of the recommendations in the report. We've adopted all recommendations, and we'll be moving practicable with the football community to action those, and that's our commitment. Now, we'll seek a mandate from the members if that's what the members require for us to move forward on that basis. But the critical thing is, as I said earlier, is really around our actions around what we do now, having received this report. Ms. Muir made comments about the earlier reports, 2010 and 2014, that weren't seen by the football community as being actioned. Some aspects of those seem to have been actioned but weren't necessarily visible to the football community. So I think key for football right now is fronting up, accepting responsibility for the things, and then really taking the appropriate actions we need to take about them.
Do you feel the board was cooperative enough during the review process?
Absolutely. Yes, I did. And I interviewed a number of them, and I interviewed a number of former board members as well. Yes.
And how forthcoming were they about their failings, if there were failings on their
They were forthcoming.
How would you describe the board and the relationship between the members on the board? Is there
I think that's a question for the board, probably. I have interviewed them all separately. I mean, I obviously presented to them this morning, and they're acting with collective responsibility.
Deryck, do you feel that there's a split within the board of how things should have been managed, or has everyone kind of taken full responsibility as well?
You'll have to talk to individual board members, I guess, around their own sort of views around it. But at our meeting this morning, certainly everybody's accepted the findings unanimously around the review and what those might mean, and the need that we need to change in New Zealand football, sort of moving forward around adopting the 22 recommendations.
Deryck, just on that, you're saying board members are free to speak to media about their views on this?
Well, they'll probably speak anyway, I'd imagine, but it's an individual matter for them. But the board is committed to the review. We had a very transparent process, you will recall, around the formulation of the review, the terms of reference, and we've been very open through the process around the review, and hence today, because there are, a lot of people said, you won't follow up in terms of the findings, and we've been very clear about the commitment all the way through this process around the review, and that means we need to look in the mirror and accept those findings and take the actions we need to take as we need to move forward in football. I mean, if we did anything else, we would have failed in our duty.
Deryck, Pips called you to set up a high performance committee. As I read NZ football statutes yesterday, they already call for one of those to exist. How long has one not existed for?
I think I couldn't comment actually in terms of that going back historically over time. I'd have to take some advice around that. I think there's been a view by some people that high performance really exists at a sort of like a management technical level within the organisation, and I think this is just my own view, is that we haven't actually utilised all the people in the game involved in the game as well, and certainly my sense from the recent football summit that Ms Muir alluded to was that there's a huge group of people who really want to contribute to football, want to be involved, want to be active in it, and we need to engage with them, because they certainly, a lot of them have a lot of technical expertise that would be really positive contributors in a high performance committee.
So it's mentioned in the statutes that NZ football should have a high performance committee, and it's part of the statutes that govern the game here. Has one not existed throughout your entire time as president?
I think there are a number of standing committees that you can have, but it isn't necessarily the case that you have to have all of them. My recommendation is they have one of these.
Deryck, given how damning the report is of the board, do you expect any changes, additions, or people to step down from the board as a result of what those findings are?
Well, I think the individual board members will make their own decisions on that. The board has the commitment to implement the findings of the review. That's, I guess, the critical thing. I think board members will make decisions around the future, their future in the game and what they wish to do, and that's really a matter for their own sort of personal judgment. But I think the key thing, certainly for the members of New Zealand football, is to know that we have received, we've accepted the report in full in terms of its findings, and we're going to be acting on that. And we've already got processes happening, as Andrew's alluded to, around the new Ferns appointment. That also requires the final sign-off of the board through that process.
But at this point, right now, do you expect that anyone's going to be standing on the board as a result?
I couldn't comment on that.
The other thing is financial constraints around implementing some of these recommendations. Do you expect that to be a factor?
I think we've got to be very cost effective about what we do and how we do it, and Ms Muir's alluded to the fact that around HR, that's a clear area of development within the organisation, and we need to invest in that area. My own sense is we're right across the football community. I think HR is an area that we could focus on. There's a conversation I think we need to have maybe with the federations around that with Sport New Zealand. It could be a shared service across sport, and maybe it's even wider than football around that. I think for me, that's one of the critical findings around, because it's not just our staff in the organisation, it's also around federations and their ongoing sort of staff development, their development plans, and how they link in, for example, around just football development, for example, linking into New Zealand football. I think there are a whole lot of dimensions to that, but we've got to be, cost constraints are always a factor, and I've got the Vice President sort of sitting in front of me, the Chair of the Finance Committee. He'll be looking very closely at those things, but we won't, we'll find a way to implement those things in the most sort of, if you like, in a manner that gives us the best outcomes for the resources we've got available.
Deryck, you said earlier that you'd be seeking, within the EXCO, seeking a mandate from the game. Does that mean you're planning on calling an extraordinary Congress before the end of the year?
I think we're going to be reflecting on the mechanism for that. We've already agreed that we should have a sort of further football summit this year. The football summit in September identified 8 key themes, and it's interesting. The number one theme identified there was really around financial sustainability. We also identified things around player pathways, which are sort of critical there as well. We've got a lot of vulnerable areas in football. The national leagues financially, it's a challenge. So there are a number of areas there. We've also got our strategic plan review coming up. So I think bringing the review findings in the context of a wider sort of setting in football with findings from the summits, if you like, and our review of our refresher, our strategic plan is a logical thing to do, and bring those together. And it's really for the members of New Zealand football to make the determinations, around the board, and we all serve at the pleasure of the members.
Andrew, just in terms of the current football firms appointment process, are you able to share the identities of those people who will be involved in making that decision?
Yeah, we're still confirming the final numbers, but just alluding to the fact that there'll be management representation, EXCO representation, PFA representation, former coaches and former players involved. So a reasonably large panel, but we're still finalising the exact numbers and names.
Will we get some names when?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
And just here on this page, it raises, as part of Pip's gone into the recruitment processes run by Andreas, it talks about a PowerPoint where you'd already put names in of certain appointments and then presented it without those names, then those names got the jobs. Is there going to be any review such as that, looking at appointments he's made and how those appointments were made?
There's no review plan for that. I'm currently confident with the staff makeup we've got, but I think what the findings and the recommendations point to is we absolutely have to be 100% transparent and rigorous with all future appointments.
Pip, just for you, you spoke to the 12 players who complained. How many other football firms players did you speak to?
I only spoke to one other player from the current squad, and I can understand that a number of them may have not wanted to take part in this at the moment. I think it's fair for me to say that, as I've commented, there needs to be rebuilding. You've got factions now developing from those who complained, those who, they all just want to play for New Zealand. So, and not everyone wants to put their head above the parapet and make these complaints. Again, that's why I use that word brave, and I don't use it lightly. So it is about rebuilding. I spoke to former Ferns, but yes, there was only one other current player who spoke to me.
And did you approach any of those other current football firms players to see if they wanted to speak, or was it just left up to
I contacted the Players Association, and the terms of reference were widely distributed. So, and all sorts of people came forward. It was an extraordinary amount of interviews.
I can take it that one other player who you mentioned is the one who said
Yes.
she wanted Andreas to stay on.
Yes. Yes.
Not one of the 12 who complained. Deryck, can I just ask you about the High Performance Committee again? I mean, the statutes say one should exist, one doesn't exist. Is that, who do you pin the non-existence of that committee on? Is that a failing of Andy Martin?
Well, the review speaks to the fact we need to have one, and I think that's been a deficiency in the organisation. So, not appropriate for me to make an attribution around the lack of one in terms of where we've got to today. But clearly, it's a deficiency in the organisation now, and I think, as I made the comment, we need to have the ability to leverage off the skills and knowledge in the game, and that's a wider setting than just our management or governance environments to do that.
Can I just ask you, you mentioned having spoken to 80 people who come to you. Is there a number that you went and approached and who spoke to you that way?
Yes, because there were people who came and spoke to me and said, I think you should also speak to so-and-so. So yes, we then reached out to them, but it was completely voluntary. And people from, it's why I wanted to explain the number of categories that people fell into. There were people with really positive stories about the good work being done about New Zealand football, as well as concerns being raised. I do want to make this balanced and make it clear that there is a lot of good stuff happening out there that people complimented about grassroots community football and the work that New Zealand football and the people here are doing.
And so that all falls into that figure of 80, or is there 80 plus more that you've spoken to? Or?
No, 80 was quite a few. Some of these interviews were 4 hours.
So I'm just trying to...
Yes,
And
yes.
Obviously when you started this, the plan was to report by the end of September.
Yes.
Taking an extra month. Is that just down to the volume?
Well, they flooded in. We had the independent email address, and they'd flooded in, so we interviewed them. And we were doing them at nights because, of course, the ferns are all around the world and things like that, so we just fitted it in. I fitted it in when I could.
You're saying here you can't talk about Andy Martin. How do you feel about the fact that you can't talk about Andy Martin, given what you described as strong feedback about him?
It is what it is. They were the terms of reference. I accepted the job on that basis.
Did you receive any complaints about him?
About who?
Andy Martin.
I can't talk about matters that are covered by privacy constraints.
Did you receive complaints about anyone other than Andreas?
I've detailed all of my findings.
Deryck, there's a large sense of frustration, I think, in the football community about Andy's departure, the way it was framed as retirement, the fact that now we see today he's not being held in judgment at all as part of this review. Do you have any apology to the football community for letting him have such a free rein?
Well, Andy participated in the review and spoke to the reviewer, and that's really a matter between the reviewer and Andy around those matters.
Can I also say that Mr. Martin was responsible? A lot of people said to me that he introduced some great financial rigour, some very good processes and financial sustainability for the organisation. We must balance all of this with that, but getting into those other areas is covered by privacy matters, and it wouldn't be fair for the President to talk about that.
Deryck, have you spoken to Andy since he retired on that Friday morning?
No, I haven't.
Do you think you'll be speaking to him ever again in the future?
I don't know. I mean, he might give me a call. I might give him a ring. I haven't spoken to Andy since.
Over the past 4 months, you've had 2 high-profile resignations and this review process. It's fair to say that we've had a significant impact on New Zealand football's financial position.
We really closely monitor our financial position and sort of the real focus on meeting our budget for this year, and that's our aim, to meet our budget for this year. I think just really like to acknowledge the work of our staff over this period. It has been a challenging period, with the review in place. But if you look at the activity over the game, we've delivered on every single sort of metric around football over the past 3-4 months. We had 2 teams qualify for World Cups age group. We've had the Women's 20 over in France. We've had the launch of the Premiership, Men's Premiership and the National League for Women. We've had the annual football awards, we've had a football summit. We've had a lot of activity going on, plus all the other normal things. We had a huge coaching program in here with 120 coaches after the review was launched, and somebody said it was probably one of the best coaching conferences we've ever had. So I think, just really would like to acknowledge all of our staff and all the volunteers in the football community and the 150,000 plus people that play football on a regular basis in New Zealand. The game's gone on, and we need to make changes to the game, no doubt about that. But football still gets delivered week in, week out by so many people in our country, and I really just would like to acknowledge that.
Guys, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for your time for attending today. Thank you for coming up here at the table. That's all for today, and we'll get you back next time.